Okay, if anybody knows what the name of this specific saw is and where I can get a new one, please let me know, because I love this thing. This one's trashed. Got trashed back in boat school by somebody who borrowed it uninvited. And if you're that person, I'm still cursing you to this day. But you can make up for it, get me a new one, no questions asked. I'll be a happy man. So what I love about these is this thing has got enough flex. It's flexing right around the bend here. I love that. I have to keep breaking away these chunks because they're holding the saw up as I progress forward. Now there's a little corner here that still has to come off. I think I'm just going to leave that more for the reason of keeping it protected until we're finished the planking job, because it's very fragile down here through this lower edge. It comes to like just to a knife edge here. I'd like to not bash that up if I can. Okay, well look at this. We got our deck on and oh, this feels great. Now I can move ahead with the actual decking. Now I'm referring to the decking as our sort of finished surface. So the plywood is giving us a lot of torsional structure, but it's quite light. It's very light plywood. And what we're going to do is we're going to add another layer of mahogany over top, and we've got some leftover planking for doing that with. And this is going to be where we're going to get some real character into this boat, and we're going to add some strength, and we're going to be creating a surface that is easier to maintain in the long run than a fiberglass surface. Let me explain that for a second. So here we got a little bit of scrap of planking, and no matter what, at some point, some idiot comes along and they're going to hit your boat. You're going to end up with a little ding just like that, and that is, you just can't get rid of that. No matter what you do, it's really hard to get rid of that. You can sand it away and try and patch up that little spot, especially if it's a bigger one, but you can never quite get it right, and there's always sort of something that shows up, and that's one thing that I hate about fiberglass surfaces. Now, I love the fact that they have an incredible amount of strength to them, but this little element bothers me. And if it's a painted surface, great, fiberglass the hell out of it. When you want it bright, I don't like it. So our finished planking is going to be our leftovers from doing our planking the sides, and we're going to lay it on here at 45 degrees to the center line, just like we did on the side planking. And I think that's going to add character, but it's also going to allow us to maximize our planking stock. So I can get away with using shorts and things like that. We don't have a ton of surface to cover, but we have just enough that I don't have quite enough planking necessarily for the whole thing, and I need to make up some difference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be adding some margins around the side, meaning those are what we would also call covering boards. And that's just going to eat up a little bit of space and give it some longitudinal character. And then this diagonal stuff is going to fill in the void in the middle. And we'll put some little margins around the cockpit combing here, and probably around the hatch and things like that too. So I think it's going to look pretty good. Now, the nice thing about using solid stock like this is if it takes a ding, it doesn't show up quite as bad. It doesn't scar the way fiberglass does. You can patch it up. You could even sand this down right down to the bare wood and still have plenty of strength left in it. And so I think that's going to be helpful in the long run for the owner. And the owner prefers this kind of idea. He likes the idea of being able to sort of fix up dings as you go easily. And I think a solid wood surface with varnish on it is actually easier to fix than if there were fiberglass on it. Now we played around with the idea of going with a herringbone finish, and that would be that's kind of a fun thought. But as I played around with it, I found the thing about herringbone is it is really hard to identify where the center line is. And you might think you just line up one of the points on these plankings on this planking, and that would be the center line, but in fact you got to split the difference between the two. And the more I played around with it, the more it felt like you get the zigzag going up the middle of the boat. No matter what, it always looked like it was off center one way or the other, because one planking would sort of be the thing that you would focus on, and you suddenly go, oh, wait a minute, this is off to one side. Then you look at the other one, you go, oh, wait a minute, the other one's off to the wrong side. We could do a more traditional, what's called a king plank, which runs down the center, and all these other planks are jogged into it. That would be fine if this was a more traditional boat. I'd consider that, but this is what I consider to be a very modern design, and I don't think that has the same place in a modern design. I think we're kind of walking away from very typical nautical traditions on this. Now, the reason for that jogged king plank is because if you have laid planks on the side, and king planks are usually used in places where you have planking that follows the shear, you know, and as it follows the shear, it stacks inboard, like so, and it notches around that king plank because you need to fasten the ends down. And to do that, you need to have enough meat on those ends that you can get a fastener in. And that means you can't have a thin, pointy end. You've got to have a little bit of a stubby end. We call that a nib end. And so the king plank is what you're seeing when you take one of these planks and it's coming in towards the center line, and as it hits this next plank here, you got to chop a little piece out in order for it to have the meat in order to put a fastener in. Likewise, if you ran your planking fore and aft, you end up with nib ends running along the covering boards. So it's sort of one or the other. It's very rarely both. If you remember our first run of planking, we started out with popsicle sticks or stir sticks or tongue depressors as our stapling cleats, and those worked okay, but they're a bit laborious to mess around with. And then we moved on to planking scraps because they're lying around and I could knock them out very quickly. Well, this time I don't really have any of that stuff lying around anymore, and our planking is going to be very efficient because it's all going to be laid straight. There's very little shape to this deck, so it's just parallel sides. I'm not going to have to fit each plank the way I did on the sides. That means I'm not going to have too many scraps, so I just went into the scrap pile and got a bunch of sticks and ripped them down into nice size scraps. So that's going to save me some time there. I've already waxed them, and we can just fly at it. I actually found what I liked when I was doing some of the sides was when I could use a long cleat over a whole range of planks and staple it frequently between each plank, and I felt like I got better hold down power from those little cleats when I did that. Okay, now I also discovered an interesting little bit of efficiency when I made my cleats just a little narrower than the width of my staples, or if I had my staples overhanging the side, it's a whole lot easier to get them out because I can just reach over there and grab them off the side with my nippers, and they pop out very easily. I'm not trying to dig them out of the face of the cleat like I am here. I only did this because I had my deck beam underneath, which is narrow. I didn't want to overshoot the deck beam, but it makes it a whole lot harder to get at those little staples. Here I got nothing to grab onto, so I got to grab them in the middle. And I break my cleat when I'm doing that. Not that it matters if I break the cleat, but if it can survive for another run, it saves me a little bit of work. So right here, this is going to be my next half hour. Just working down the boat, popping these things out. All right, we've got all of the staples out of this deck, and our next job is to try and trim it down. I'm of mixed minds about this. On one hand, I feel like I would be better off leaving this rough overhang, because when I put my next bit of stuff on there, it just gives somewhere for glue to go and stuff like that. On the other side of the coin, I feel like I should trim it down because I want to do a nice clean layout of what my decking is going to look like before I start doing it. Because I know what I think I want to do, but I will be the first to admit sometimes my first inclinations are not my best inclinations. And there's nothing like what essentially is a full-scale drawing, or lofting if you will, to help figure out what you're going to do. So I think we're going to trim it down. I'm going to use my laminate trimmer here to do it. I'm going to be very careful around the sides because we don't have a 90-degree angle here, and I don't want to trim it back too far, so I'm going to have to think a little bit about how I'm going to tackle the sides, and I might switch to a different laminate trimmer that has a base I can angle. Of course, that won't work through the whole length of the thing. Now, there's one other reason I wanted to trim it flush, beyond just laying this out. I want to do my field, the inner portion first, and then use my laminate trimmer set up with a little fence that will follow the shear line in order to cut back the edge of that planking to a nice, clean, consistent line that we can then add our margins to. What I don't want to do is build margins and then fart around with little bits of planking, trimming both ends, trying to get them all to fit in nicely. That feels like it's a real time killer. So I'm going to do the margins second, the field first. Well, I decided to just do this by hand. I really don't want to screw this up, and it can happen so easily. And I'm so close to just moving ahead without screw-ups that I'm just going to take a little bit of extra time it takes to do it by hand, then try and save the time that I might get from doing it by a machine, but possibly screwing up and requiring more time to fix that. Does that make sense? Bookkeepers can crunch the numbers on that. I could do it with a router, and I will on the inside of the combing here, because I got lots of wiggle room for screwing up. But on the outside, I really don't want to screw this up. And I decided the way I know I will not screw up is just doing it by hand. But anyhow, so the way I'm going to tackle this is I've got some tape on the side to protect the hull. And I put that there before when I was doing the glue up, and I just left it in place. I've taken my block plane and I'm skewing that blade over so that on one side it's projecting out to, say, a middling size cut, and on the other side it is below the sole of the plane. And so I can use it thusly. Where my plywood is projecting out and it's deep, I just go at it with the heavier cut side of the plane. As I get closer, I can raise that plane up and get to where I'm taking just the tiniest little bit. Also, by doing this, I've got the tape here to protect the side of the hull. I can run that plane on that tape and approximate the angle between the deck and the hull very, very accurately. And so my result is I've got a nice, beautiful flush cut all through here, and that's going to be a winding bevel as I go through the length of the boat. Easy peasy, accurate the whole way. Now there's a couple other things I could have done instead. I could have used something like this. This is a little stick I have. It's an extension stick. And for those of you who might have been watching Tips from a Shipwright, you would have seen Lou use something very similar when he was doing the chines on the skiff that he's building right now. He basically has used a stick like this that stretches across the breadth of the boat from one chine to the other, and it will give him sort of an accurate angle. So this is intended to do something very similar, and I made this years ago for a different application, and maybe one day we'll get into why I use it or how I use it. But for this, I could use it in two different ways. I could use it like so, wherein it hangs down and it approximates the angle of the hull. Or I could flip it over, and this is made to obviously screw on either side of my plane. I could take a little block of wood, this piece of plywood here, and a little C-clamp, okay? And then, actually let's drop it down here. And then I could use it like so on the side of my hull, and this is acting like a depth stop. And so I could set it up so I just have, say, the thickness of the plywood protruding. So there's a nice simple little innovation. And you know what? Drilling and tapping a couple holes into the sides of your plane is something that's actually quite handy. There's all kinds of things you can come up with. Even if, say, for instance, you like using your plane with a shooting board, you could attach a handle onto the side. Give you something to hang on to when you're using it as a shooting board. As a boat builder, you should get yourself familiar with some basic metalworking techniques. Drilling and tapping is one of those. There's a lot of metal work that happens in boat building. You don't need to be a professional welder or anything like that. You don't need to be a professional machinist, but you do need to have a bare minimum of very basic metalworking skills under your belt, in my opinion. And some of those might just be working with a hacksaw and a file to shape things and reduce things in size. Drilling and tapping is another one. And I think soldering is a really good one to have. And I don't mean electronic soldering or anything, I mean silver soldering. Anyhow, back to this job. Before I get going, just check that my blade's set so. So I'm just going to keep working away at this. Just keep checking my work. And as I get closer to my finished line, raise that plane up. And I can actually feel where it's cutting nothing to just slowly dropping it down until it's cutting a little bit. Check my progress and just keep working backwards. And I've talked about this before, what direction to work. I'm working backwards. And that means that I've always got my eyes down here, sighting down the work that I've already done so I can look for little dips or hollows or little bits of unfairness. And as I'm working, I know I've got meat back here to take off. I don't have to pay attention to that. If I were working this way, I'm constantly coming back, and there's always a worry that I'm going to start digging in back here where I'm not paying attention while I'm working my way that way. So I find working backwards very helpful, and and working with your plane backwards just works just fine. If you look at Asian tools, Japanese tools, they usually work on the pull stroke instead of the push stroke, and we can make our Western tools do that too. I should point out I've got a double layer of tape here, and every now and then my blade catches it, and you can see it did that just now. And so what that means is it has alerted me to the fact that I've zeroed out in that one spot, taken a bit of tape off, but I'm still protected, and that's important. I screwed up a tiny bit, but my screw up had no detrimental effects because I took some precautions ahead of time, knowing that I would probably do exactly this and might run into that exact same situation. This is the stuff you learn by screwing up. Okay, we are ready to figure out how to design our deck. I sort of figured out what I want to do, but there's some details that I just didn't feel like screwing around with at scale. I thought, let's go full scale with figuring out those details. So first thing is, I think we need to establish a center line. And while it's always important to have a perfect center line from the bow of the boat to the stern of the boat to make sure everything's symmetrical, at this point in the build, I don't even want to know because there's nothing I can do about it now. However, I do have the center of the bow and the center of the cockpit, which is important because you're looking at that. And then I got the same thing at the back deck. And so long as those two elements are centered to each other, I'm happy with it. So I'm just going to lay out a center line right down here. I've already marked my points. So whatever we do, it's going to jive up with that line. I'll do the same thing back here. Now somewhere near the stern, I'm going to switch to a different pattern on the planking and create a little transom. But I don't know where that is just yet, so I'm not going to worry about that. That's going to be part of this process. And one thing I always do when I'm building a boat is there's various elements that I always make sure I have center lines marked on. For instance, I've got one marked on the bulkhead, I've got it marked on the keelson, and I've got it marked on deck beams. And I always make sure in a few spots, I always put that mark in with a knife. I don't want to be able to sand that thing out. I want to be able to find it at any stage in the build. I think that's really important. And it's very easy to lose your center line if you haven't done that. So in the finished product, there's going to be a few spots where you see this little mark. That's fine, because somewhere down the road, someone's going to be doing a repair on this boat, or because of damage, or neglect, or whatever, just age, and they're probably going to want to make use of a center line for something. I want to make sure they can find the one that I established, and it's going to help them out. So one thing I thought about doing are these margins, and I'm going to mark out 2-inch wide margins. I already did it on this side. Now we would also refer to these as covering boards. Now, covering boards in a traditional build is basically a deck plank that is intended to cover your frame heads. And throughout the life of a boat, especially larger boats, there's times where you need to get at those frames. You want to replace them, you need to be able to get at them without tearing the whole boat to pieces. And so the covering board gives you access to those points. Now, I was also going to do margins around the cockpit here. And I'm going to draw them in right now. I was thinking that maybe they should be a little bit narrower, but I hadn't decided on that for sure. This doesn't have to be a perfect line right now. This is just design. So I'm going to just pop a couple push pins here right into my center line. And that's just to give me something for this to bear up against. Come on, stay put. But anyway, so if I lay one plank up against there, that gives me 45 degrees. And I already talked about this with my customer, going 45 degrees to the center line. So if I just start laying these across like so, I want to think about how it interacts with my margins. So this is a margin that's going to be through here. So that'll be like that. But now this one, part of the reason for the margins is to stretch out this stock because I only have so much of it. So I'm kind of wondering if I should think about maybe, I've got the combing here, which is going to look a lot like a margin board. So maybe I just want to go with the combing there and let this stuff run through to that combing shape. So if I do that, and here's got another one. And I thought once we get to the side decks here is another spot that I can save on some planking stock by switching from this planking stock to a different material that fills in this gap over here. So I'm just going to keep leapfrogging down. So as I get down here, I just want to sketch this in. Get down to there. So say that's our margin board. And we've got our combing that's going to come along like so. I'm thinking at this point, I switch to, maybe we go one more. Frog down one more. And then I could switch to longitudinal for a stretch. Would that look funny? I don't think so. In fact, I could probably, at this point, have this margin board stop there. That gets the same miter cut as this. It carries that line through. And then we have this whole other piece that fills in the blank until we're back here where it gets wider again. How wide a solid piece would I need? I could get it out of 6-inch wide stock or even 5.5, so that's good. So I have to mill up a a specific piece of material for that, but that's not the end of the world. And I would have to come back to my other shape once I get back here. I don't mind that. Do I like that? It's a real question. Yeah, I kind of do. I think if I did it, if I did combing and a margin board, let's try and mock this up again. So there's a margin, and then there's a margin around the cockpit there. Getting into a lot of little short pieces, and then combing on top of that. I don't think I like that as much as just having that be combing. Yep. Okay, I think I like that. Now the question I have is, where do I start the planking? So I guess one question is, do we start it right at this intersection? I guess it would make sense for full width planks to start walking their way up the center line from there. Let's see what happens if we walk up from there towards the bow. So that's our first plank. Two. I'm trying to not cover this thing in little marks right now, because that's going to come back to bite me if I do that. And the last one, yeah, that works okay. All right, let me play around back aft now. My customer and I already discussed whether or not we should reverse the planking at the back end, and we decided not to. We came to the conclusion we'd like to just see it continue in the same orientation. So back here, if we start with, come on, suppose if we start right at the cockpit combing with a intersection there. Then walking it this way. Come around the cockpit. And then we are getting close to our last, yeah, right there. Right there we could conceivably switch to our longitudinal. Or maybe we do one more. Yeah, I think I like that. I have to go back and play around at the bow again now that I've sort of got an idea. So I think my longitudinal switch, step down to our back to our regular margin board around here. Now let's walk it down towards the other side. So boom, boom. I want to see where it's going to land in here. So if we come to this, okay, oh, that's good. So I'm planning to have margins coming across the both ends of the hatch here, just to sort of conceal this line. So if we do that, that terminates nicely. Okay, so that's what our half of our hatch would look like. That'd be the miter up the middle, the margin board down the side. And then as I walk down towards the stern, just use the shorter ones. Somewhere down here we need to switch to a cross-grain transom. We're going to do it somewhere right around the hard turn, so I guess right around here. probably pick a spot where one of these boards terminates right at the corner. Something like that. Okay, I think I got a pretty good plan now. I've worked out the basics of how I want this to look. I think it's going to look pretty good. So we'll go like that there. So I just need to get out my planking stock, make sure these edges are clean, and so I got to decide if I'm going to shove it all through the table saw just to sweeten it up a little bit. And luckily I can work both ends of the boat at the same time, because this portion in between is going to be broken up, so I don't have to worry about exact spacing all the way through, which is fantastic. I think I just want to play around with this, where the margin boards start and stop up here before I move ahead. I mean, we got a rough idea, but I think I should look at that just a little more, or maybe what I should do is get my planking dealt with so I have an absolute 100% finished width. Yeah, and then I can play with that, because it's just a little bit of a juggle. I'd love it to terminate with a full plank at the forward end. I guess it doesn't matter as much at the back end here. I just want to thank all my followers on Patreon whose monthly pledges help support this channel, but I also want to thank everybody else who watches these videos, who shares them, likes them, and subscribes to the channel. You all help to promote this thing that we're doing, and I really appreciate all of you.